Spiritual Theology, Part 19. Prayer of Quiet. The prayer of quiet is a type of mystical prayer in which the intimate awareness of God's presence captivates the will and fills the soul, arid body with an ineffable sweetness and delight. The fundamental difference between the prayer of quiet and that of infused recollection, apart from a greater intensity of contemplated life and more tense consolations, is that the prayer of quiet gives the soul an actual possession and a joyful fruition of the sovereign good. Nature of the prayer of quiet. Infused contemplation principally affects the intellect, which is withdrawn from other faculties, but the prayer of quiet especially affects the will. Although the intellect and the memory are now tranquil, they still remain free to realize what is occurring, but the will is entirely captivated and absorbed in God. For that reason, the prayer of quiet, as its name indicates, tends to contemplative silence and repose. Since the other faculties remain free, however, they can be occupied with the work of the active life. They may do so with great intensity. The will does not lose its sweet quietude, but the activities of Martha and Mary begin to merge in a beautiful manner, as St. Teresa points out. Yet, the perfect blending of the active and contemplative life will not be achieved until the soul has reached the state of union with God. St. Teresa describes the prayer of quiet in the following way. From this recollection there proceeds an interior quiet and peace that are full of happiness, because the soul is in such a state that it does not seem to lack anything, and even speaking, I refer to vocal prayer and meditation, wearies it. It wishes to do nothing but love. This state may last for some time, and even the long periods of time. Effects on the prayer of quiet. The sanctifying effects produced in the soul by the prayer of quiet are enumerated by St. Teresa in the 4th mansions of her interior castle. 1. Great spirit of liberty. 2. Filial fears of God and great care not to offend him. 3. Profound confidence in God. 4. Love of mortification and suffering. 5. Deep humility. 6. Disdain for worldly pleasures. 7. Growth in all virtues. Concomitant phenomena. The concomitant phenomena that usually accompany the prayer of quiet are sleep of the faculties and inebriation of love. In her autobiography, St. Teresa listed the sleep of the faculties as a distinct grade of mystical prayer superior to the prayer of quiet. But in her later work she changed her opinion and considered the sleep of the faculties as an effect of the prayer of quiet in the highest degree of intensity. According to St. Teresa, the sleep of the faculties is a phenomena in which the faculties are not completely captivated, and yet they do not understand how they work. The sweetness and delight they experience are beyond anything they have known previously. The soul seems to be unable to advance or to turn back. It wishes only to enjoy this great delight. It is as if the soul were completely dead to the things of this world and enjoyed God alone. It is a heavenly foolishness in which the soul learns true wisdom. Sometimes the intense delight produced by the sleep of the faculties causes a kind of divine inebriation, which is manifested externally in a kind of foolishness of love. Sometimes there are cries of love, or even bodily movements such as leaps of joy or the singing of spiritual hymns. The love of God is so intense that it cannot be contained but must burst forth into external acts. Norms of conduct. The general rule of conduct for the soul in any of the states of contemplative prayer is to cooperate completely with the working of grace and to cultivate an increasingly profound humility. For the prayer of quiet in particular, the following rules should be carefully followed. 1. Never attempt to force oneself into this grade of prayer. It would indeed be futile, because mystical prayer cannot be obtained by one's own efforts. 2. Cooperate with the divine movement as soon as it is experienced. One should not delay for a single instant, under the pretext, but should follow the divine movement with all docility and humility. 3. Do not disturb the quiet of the will by attending to the activities of the lower faculties. The memory and the imagination, since they are still free for their own operations, could easily become a distraction in the prayer of quiet. Saint Teresa advises the soul not to pay attention to these operations, but to ignore them until such time as God will bind them and captivate them. 4. Scrupulously avoid any occasion of offending God. Saint Teresa warns that the devil frequently provides temptations and occasions of sin to souls who are in this degree of prayer, and she emphasizes the great damage that is done by little acts of fidelity and grace. 5. Never abandon the practice of prayer in spite of any difficulty or obstacle. Saint Teresa places stress on this particular rule, and she repeats it again and again throughout her writings. She states that if a soul in this grade of prayer should fall into sin through weakness or malice, it can always recapture the good it has lost. But if it does not return to the practice of prayer, it will go from bad to worse. She also asserts that the soul should not abandon itself excessively to the sleep of the faculties. She states that some persons have such weak constitution that as soon as they experience any spiritual consolation, they mistakenly think it is a true spiritual sleep. The more they abandon themselves to this experience, the weaker they become physically, with the result that they think they are in a state of rapture. Actually, all they are doing is wasting their time and ruining their health. She makes it very clear that when there is truly spiritual sleep of the faculties, there is no weakness or languor in the soul. Rather, the soul is filled with great joy. Moreover, the experience does not last for a long time, although the soul may return to this sleep of faculties. Nor is there any exterior sensation or rapture when this experience is truly from God. Saint Teresa advises that persons of a weak constitution should eat and eat well until they have regained their physical strength, and if their constitution remains weak, they can take this as a sign that God is not calling them to the mystical degrees of prayer. The inebriation of love should not be confused with natural effervescence and sentimentality, which are often found in enthusiastic and impressionable individuals. And even if it is a question of true phenomena, the soul should not let itself be carried away by this experience, but should strive to control and moderate it. Above all, one should not take this phenomena as a sign that it is far advanced in the spiritual life, but should humble itself before God and never seek to practice in order to obtain consolations from God. Spiritual directors should always insist on the necessity of the practice of virtue, that they should attach little importance to these phenomena, especially if they can perceive that the soul is in itself attaching great importance to them, or is beginning to manifest a certain degree of vanity. In fact, when these phenomena are truly from God, the soul is usually submerged in true humility. Thus, humility is a great touchstone for the distinguishing of true gold from dross. Prayer of Union. The prayer of union is that grade of mystical prayer in which all the internal faculties are gradually captivated and occupied with God. In the prayer of quiet, only the will was captivated. The sleep of the faculties, the intellect was also captivated, although the memory and the imagination remained free. In the prayer of union of all interior faculties, including the memory and the imagination, are captivated. Only the external bodily senses are now free, but they too will be captivated in the following grade of prayer. Nature of the prayer of union. The intensity of the mystical experience caused by the prayer of union is indescribable. It is superior beyond compare to that of the preceding grade, to the point that the body itself is affected by the working of God in the soul. Without being entirely captivated, the external senses become almost helpless and inoperative. The soul experiences divine reality with such intensity that it could easily fall into ecstasy. At the beginning, this sublime absorption of the faculties in God lasts but a short time, a half hour at most. But as the intensity increases, it may be prolonged for several hours. The following excerpt from the writings of St. Teresa describes the prayer of union. It seems to me that this kind of prayer is very definitely a union of the entire soul with God, although it seems that His Majesty desires to give permission to the faculties to understand and enjoy the great things that He is effecting there. It sometimes happens, and indeed very often, that when the will is in union, the soul understands that the will is captive, and enjoying fruition of that will alone, is experiencing too much, while the intellect and the memory are so free that they can attend to other matters and be engaged in works of charity. This, although it may seem to be the same, is actually different from the prayer of quiet of which I have already spoken, partly because in that prayer the soul would not wish to be occupied in anything else, or to be active, since it is enjoying the holy repose of Mary. But in this prayer it can also be Martha, so that it is, as it were, occupied in both the active and contemplative life, performing works of charity and duties of state, and reading, although souls in this state are not masters of themselves, when they realize that the better part of the soul is occupied elsewhere. It is as if we were speaking to one person while the other person is speaking to us, with the result that we cannot fully be attentive to one or the other. Signs of the prayer of union. The essential characteristics of the prayer of union and the signs by which it can be recognized and distinguished from other grades of prayer are the following. 1. Absence of distractions. The reason for this is that the memory and imagination, which are the faculties that usually cause distraction, are now fixed on God and held captive. There may be a return to lower grades of prayer from time to time, and then distractions may again disturb the soul. But during the prayer of union, distractions are psychologically impossible. 2. Certitude of being intimately united with God. The soul cannot doubt that it experiences God during the prayer of union. On leaving the lower grades of prayer, the soul may experience certain doubts or fears that it was not truly united with God, or that it was deceived by the devil. But in the prayer of union and certitude, experiencing God is so absolute that the Saint Teresa maintains that if the soul does not experience this certitude, it did not have the true prayer of union. 3. Absence of weariness and tedium. The soul absorbed in God never wearies of its union with the Beloved. It is overwhelmed with delight, and however long the prayer of union may last, the soul never experiences any fatigue. For this reason, St. Teresa says that this grade of prayer can never do any harm to the individual, no matter how long it may last. St. Teresa lists the principal effects of the prayer of union in the 5th mansions of her interior castle. The soul is so anxious to please God that it would gladly die 1,000 deaths for his sake. It has an intense longing to suffer great trials, and experiences vehement desires for penance and solitude. 3. Absence of weariness and tedium. The soul absorbed in God never wearies of its union with the Beloved. It is overwhelmed with delight, and however long the prayer of union may last, the soul never experiences any fatigue. For that reason, St. Teresa says that this grade of prayer can never do any harm to the individual, no matter how long it may last. St. Teresa lists the principal effects of prayer of union in the 5th mansions of her interior castle. The soul is so anxious to praise God that it would gladly die 1,000 deaths for his sake. It had been an intense longing to suffer great trials, and experiences vehement desires for penance and solitude. It wishes that all souls would know God, and it is greatly saddened when it sees that God is offended. The soul is dissatisfied with everything that it sees on earth, since God has given it wings so that it can fly to him. And whatever it does for God seems very little by comparison with what it desires to do. Its weakness has been turned into strength, and it is no longer bound by any ties of relationship or friendship or worldly possessions. It is grieved at having to be conceived of the things of earth, lest these things should cause it to sin against God. Everything wearies it because it can find no true rest in any created thing. Concomitant phenomena. The prayer of union is usually accompanied by certain concomitant phenomena distinct from grate, gratis, date. Although these phenomena do not occur at any definite moment and are transitory graces that God grants according to his good pleasure, they are usually experienced when the soul reaches this degree of prayer. There are four principal concomitant phenomena: mystical touches, flights of the spirit, fiery darts of love, and wounds of love. St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila give detailed descriptions of this phenomenon. The mystical touches are a kind of instantaneous supernatural impression that gives the soul a sensation of having been touched by God himself. This divine contact imparts to the soul an ineffable delight that defies description. The soul sometimes utters a cry or falls into ecstasy. The touches themselves admit to varying degrees of intensity, but most sublime are those that St. John of the Cross describes as substantial touches. The expression designates that the soul senses the mystical touches as if they had been experienced in the very center or substance of the soul, although in reality they are experienced in the spiritual faculties of the intellect and will. St. John of the Cross warns souls that they should not attempt to experience these mystical touches by their own efforts, but should remain humble and resigned before God, and passively receive whatever he deigns to send them. Flights of the Spirit, as the names indicate, are strong and unexpected impulses of love of God that leave the soul with a consuming thirst for God. The soul feels that it should never satiate its thirst for love, even if all creation were permeated with divine love. Sometimes the mere mention of God causes a soul to react with such violent impetus that the body is overwhelmed by an ecstatic trance. A remarkable note in regard to these violent impulses is that they never cause any physical or mental harm to the individual, although any similar impulse in the purely natural order would be seriously harmful. Saint Teresa wisely cautions individual to make a careful distinction between those impulses of love that flow from some natural cause, and must therefore be controlled by reason, and the true mystical touches that are passively received by the soul from God. According to St. John of the Cross, the fiery darts of love are certain hidden touches that, like a fiery arrow, burn and pierce the soul and leave it completely cauterized by the fire of love. St. Teresa describes this phenomena as a wounding of the soul, as if an arrow pierced the soul. It causes great affliction, and at the same time it is very delectable. The wound is not a physical one, but is felt deep within the soul, and seems to spring from the soul's inmost depths. It arouses profound desires for truth and a kind of hatred of the body, which seems at that time to be an obstacle to the soul's fruition of God. The wounds of love are similar to the preceding phenomena, but they are more profound and more lasting. St. John of the Cross remarks that the fiery darts of love are usually caused by the knowledge of God that the soul receives through created things, while the wounds of love are caused by the knowledge of the works of the Incarnation and the mysteries of faith. The effects of these wounds are similar to the effects of the fiery darts, but they are more profound. The soul longingly complains to God at not being able to leave this life, or to enjoy the intimate union with Him in heaven. One of the best commentaries on this phenomena is found in the Spiritual Canticle, stanzas 9 through 11. The prayer of conforming union. The prayer of union, as we have seen, unites the soul intimately with God and is, in a sense, the last grade of mystical prayer, although it admits of degrees of intensity. Saint Teresa retreats of the prayer of union in the last three mansions of the interior castle, and assigns the types of this prayer as follows. Fifth mansions, the prayer of union. Sixth mansions, spiritual betrothal. 7 mansions, spiritual marriage. But she likewise explains that these three are generically the same prayer. The difference lies in the degree to which God unites the soul to Himself. Some authors, wishing to use St. Teresa's terminology, call this degree of union the spiritual betrothal or espousal. Others call it the prayer of ecstatic union, taking the name from the predominant external phenomena of this prayer. We prefer, however, to use the expressions conforming and transforming union for these last two degrees of mystical prayer. First, because some persons find the betrothal and marriage symbols distasteful, and secondly, because the term ecstatic union stresses a concomitant phenomena rather than the union between the soul and God. Nature of conforming union. In the prayer of simple union, all the interior faculties of the soul are centered on God alone. Only the external senses are still free. But in the prayer of conforming union, God captivates even the external senses, with the result that the soul is totally divinized, so to speak, and prepared by God to move to the full and final commitment of the transforming union. This means that the conforming union is closely connected to the prayer of simple union, and indeed its expansion. Saint Teresa says as much when she remarks that there is in the fifth or sixth mansions is the same, but the effects are different. In the prayer of conforming union, therefore, the soul loses the use of its external senses, either partially or totally, because all the interior faculties are absorbed in God, and the senses are alienated from their proper natural functioning. It is with difficulty that the soul turns its attention to external activity, though it knows that sometimes it must leave God for God in performing its duties or services of charity for others. But the predominant sentiment of these souls is the longing for full and perfect union with God, accompanied by a longing for death. The soul now echoes the yearning of St. Paul to be dissolved and to be with Christ, Philippians 1:23, and the statement of St. Teresa as a child, I want to see God, but to see God we must die. Saint Teresa has given us a clear and detailed description of the prayer of conforming union in the Life and in the 6 mansions of the interior castle. St. John of the Cross treats of this grade of prayer in the spiritual canticle, and the living flame, but she says that although this would be a place to discuss the different kinds of rapture and ecstasy experienced by the spiritual persons, I pass over the subject because the Blessed Teresa of Jesus, our mother, left notes admirably written upon these things of the Spirit. We shall, therefore, follow closely the teaching of St. Teresa in describing the conforming union, which she calls spiritual betrothal. And now you are going to see what His Majesty does to confirm this betrothal, for this, as I understand it, is what happens when He bestows raptures which carry the soul out of its senses. For if, while still in possession of its senses, the soul saw that it was never so near to such great majesty, it might perhaps be unable to remain alive. In position, in this case, as I understand it, is that the soul has never before been so finally awake to the things to them, or had such a light or such knowledge of His Majesty. This may seem impossible because if the faculties are so completely absorbed that we might describe them as dead, and the senses are so as well, how can the soul be said to understand this secret? I cannot say, nor perhaps can any creature. St. John of the Cross speaks of the prayer of conforming union in similar terms, that we may the better understand what flight this is. It is to be noted that, as we have said, in the visitation of the divine Spirit, the spirit of the soul is enraptured with great force to commune with the Spirit and abandons the body, ceases to experience feelings and to have its actions in the body, since it has them in God. For this cause, said St. Paul, with respect to that rapture of his, he knew not if his soul was receiving it in the body or out of the body. In the ecstatic experience of the conforming union, the soul has not only has contact with God in the very center of the soul, it also seems to peer into the very essence of God and discover divine secrets. Saint Teresa emphasizes also that ecstatic prayer is characterized by a new and great light, unlike any the soul has ever seen before, so much so that the soul feels as if it had been in another world. Mystical ecstasy. Ecstasy enters into the nature and definition of the prayer of conforming union, and that is why some authors prefer to use the name ecstatic prayer. The soul experiences that it is in God and God is in the soul, and the concentration is so complete that all faculties are absorbed in this union. It is, in a sense, the experienced fulfillment of the first precept of charity. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Deuteronomy 6:5, Matthew 22:37. Mystical ecstasy is therefore a concomitant or normal phenomena of the prayer of conforming union. Unlike prophetic ecstasy, which is a gratia gratis data, mystical ecstasy is both sanctifying and meritorious. The essential element in this prayer, however, is the absorption of the soul in God. The ecstasy is a secondary but concomitant element. Both of these elements are necessary for the true mystical ecstasy. Without the union with God I infuse the contemplative prayer, ecstasy would be a natural ecstasy or trance, a falsification of mystical ecstasy caused by a evil spirit, or the gratia gratis data of prophetic ecstasy. The efficient cause of mystical ecstasy in the Holy Spirit working through his gifts, operating through the gifts of wisdom and understanding, he uses the latter to illuminate faith, and the former to stimulate charity to a most vehement love that causes the alienation of the senses. The formal cause of ecstasy is an intense degree of infused contemplation, although not the maximum degree. A less intense form of contemplation would not cause the suspension of the faculties. The highest degrees of the mystical prayer do not cause any ecstasy. When the individual is accustomed to have the divine illumination and is strengthened sufficiently to withstand it, and as occurs in the highest degree of the mystical life, all ecstasy will disappear. The principal forms of ecstasy are the gentle and delightful ecstasy and the violent and painful ecstasy. In the first, it seems that the soul is no longer in the body, and the body itself has the experience of losing its natural warmth. Nevertheless, it is accompanied by a great sweetness and delight. This form of ecstasy is in no way harmful to health. Rather, it often improves the individual's health. In its violent and painful form, the bodily suffering is so intense that the individual can hardly bear it. It seems sometimes as if the entire body has been dislocated. St. John of the Cross states that it seems as if all the bones have dried up and that the body has lost all its strength. Sometimes the body becomes completely cold and appears as if dead. The sweet and delightful form of ecstasy is simply ecstasy. The painful form is called transport, flight of the spirit, or rapture. Ecstasy sometimes produces notable effects on the body, the soul of the ascetic. The ecstatic has no sensation of any material thing, and there is no awareness through visions of any objects in the vicinity, as can be proved by passing some object, even a bright light, in front of the opened eyes of the ecstatic. The vital functions seem to be interrupted. There is no evident sign of respiration, of circulation of the blood, or any movement to the lips. The sweet and gentle ecstasy is never harmful to bodily health, but often restores or improves it. After the violent ecstasy, on the one hand, the body sometimes remains exhausted and painful over a period of 48 days. Perhaps only those who have experienced the ecstatic states of the prayer of conforming union can describe them properly and distinguish between ecstasy and transport in the spirit of rapture. But even St. Teresa found difficulty in doing so. I should like, with the help of God, to be able to describe the difference between union and rapture, or elevation, or what they call flight of the spirit, or transport. It is all one. I mean that these different names all refer to the same thing, which is also called ecstasy. It is much more beneficial than union. The effects it produces are far more important, and has great many more operations, for union gives the impression of being just the same as at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and it all happens interiorly. But the ends of these raptures are both interior and exterior. Effects of ecstatic prayer. It is possible to study ecstasy under three different aspects: the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual. It would be very difficult to differentiate truly mystical ecstasies from natural or diabolical ecstasy by using the physical or psychological aspects exclusively. In fact, the physical and psychological manifestations of ecstasy are usually identical, whether the ecstasy has a natural, a divine, or a diabolical cause. Consequently, it is necessary to study the effects of ecstasy in order to judge whether it is truly mystical and of supernatural origin. By their fruits you shall know them. St. Teresa lists 5 different types of ecstasy in the spiritual relations. She also provides us with various phenomena that sometimes accompany each type. Some of these phenomena are extraordinary phenomena, while others are what we would call concomitant to ecstatic prayer of the conforming union. Nor should one understand that a mystic will necessarily experience all 5 types of ecstasy. St. Teresa makes no such assertion, nor does she attempt to present the types of a series of ecstatic steps by the soul which reaches the transformation. The first kind of ecstasy comes on gradually and reaches the point in which the soul loses contact with its surroundings and is drawn to God alone. The soul is conscious of what is going on around it, but as if at a great distance. The impression of the union with God is so vivid that it may take the soul several days to adjust to its normal life and surroundings. This type of ecstasy results in a profound knowledge of God that causes the soul to have great disdain for all created things. At the same time, it is made aware of its own misery, the extent of its failures to serve God, and its great indebtedness to God. As a result, the soul grows in humility, feels an ardent love for God and a consuming desire to serve Him as perfectly as possible. Gladly would the soul accept martyrdom for the love of God. The second type of ecstasy, called rapture, comes through a hidden light shed by His Majesty in the very depth of his soul, with a swiftness of movement that seemed to carry away the higher part of it, or to separate the soul from the body. The soul needs the courage to submit itself totally to God, and to let Him lead it where He will. If the soul is quite determined to die for Him, the virtues will be all the stronger because of this. And with its deeper knowledge, there will also be an increase in the fear and love of fear. At the same time, the soul experiences profound sorrow at ever having offended God, and so desires that no one will ever offend Him. This, I think, says St. Teresa, must be the source of its intense desire for the salvation of souls, and its longing that it may itself have a part in this, and that God may be praised as He deserves. In the third kind of ecstasy, flight of the spirit, there seems to come out of the soul something swift and subtle, which rises to its higher parts and goes whither the Lord wills. More than this it is impossible to explain. It is like a flight, who knows nothing else with which to compare it. The soul is better able now to occupy itself with the work given it by the Lord, and it enjoys great certitude and security. Three things in particular are bestowed on the soul in the flight of the Spirit: knowledge of the greatness of God, self-knowledge and humility, and a supreme contempt for earthly things. Some mystics at this stage also receive extraordinary phenomena, imaginative or intellectual visions, bodily levitation, or revelations. The fourth type of ecstasy is caused by a spiritual struggle or transport resulting from the sudden remembrance, when the soul is not engaged in prayer, of its absence from God or something to that effect. It is a distressing type of ecstasy, because nothing created can give comfort to the soul or satisfy its desires, but at the same time it cannot possess God as it desires. It feels itself to be in a state of deep loneliness and total abandonment, such as cannot be described. For the world and all worldly things cause it distress, and no created thing can provide it with companionship. It seeks nothing but the Creator, yet sees that without dying it is impossible for it to have him. It sees itself suspended between heaven and earth, and has no idea what to do. It leaves the limbs so disjointed and the bones so racked that the hands have not power enough to write. It also produces grievous pains. Nothing of this is felt until that impulse has passed away. This, according to some authors, constitutes the passive purgation of the spirit, which is necessary for the soul before the soul can proceed to the transforming union, and, according to St. Teresa, the only comparison of these pains is the suffering of purgatory. Visions are often associated with this type of ecstasy, and St. Teresa states that she experienced ecstatic impulses only after she had experienced other types of ecstasy. Lastly, St. Teresa speaks of the wound of love, which closely resembles the ecstatic impulse. It is not a question of physical pain, although it may result in severe bodily pain after the experience has passed. The interior sensation is like that of a fiery arrow shot into the soul, and the sudden impact may make the individual cry out when it happens. Yet the wound is one of such sweet delight that the soul would like it to continue. To experience itself may be of brief duration, or it may last several hours. The faculties of the soul are inactive as long as it lasts, and there is the usual drop in body temperature and slowness of pulse, but no bodily rigidity or suspended animation, though frequently the experience terminates in a true trance or a vision. The effects of the wound of love are described by St. Teresa as follows. These effects are desires for God, so quick and so subtle as to be indescribable. As the soul finds itself tied and bound so, it cannot have fruition of God as it would wish. It conceives a great hatred for the body, and then it sees how little was the event that came to us through the sin of Adam. The soul loses all fear of any trials and sufferings that may come to it. It has far more contempt for the world than previously. It is much more detached from created things. It has a holy horror of ever offending God. The spiritual betrothal, or covenant between God and the soul, occurs during an ecstatic union with God. In this ecstasy, says St. Teresa, the soul has never before been so fully awake to the things of God, or had such light or such knowledge of his majesty. The spiritual betrothal, as its name indicates, is essentially a promise of marriage, an espousal. It may be accompanied by a vision of Christ, the bestowal of a symbolic ring, the exchange of hearts, or a locution in which Christ formally espouses himself to the soul. Spiritual betrothal is the high point of the prayer of conforming union, and at the same time the transition to mystical marriage. Father Marie Eugene states that in the three periods or phases that precede mystical marriage, the first is one of preliminary mortification, the second is the passive purgation of the spirit, and the third is the divine touches or visits in which occurs the spiritual betrothal. Thus, the spiritual betrothal is a passage from the passive purgation of the spirit to the perfect union of the mystical marriage. The prayer of transforming union. The last grade of prayer is the transforming union, identified by many mystics as spiritual marriage. It constitutes the seventh mansion of the interior castle of St. Teresa, and is the highest degree of perfection one can attain in this life. It is, therefore, a prelude to the beatific life of glory. This state is nothing less than a transformation into God, and St. John of the Cross does not hesitate to use such expressions as transformed into God by love, God of gods by participation, and more divine than human. Such expressions may seem daring or even excessive when applied to the spiritual life of the soul, but they are fully justified by a usage that goes back to St. John, St. Paul, and the Fathers of the Church, especially the Eastern Church. St. John of the Cross says of this grade of prayer, "There is as great a difference between these states as there is between betrothal and marriage. For betrothal there is only a consent by agreement, and a unity of will between two parties, and the jewels and the adornment of the bride-to-be given her graciously by the bridegroom. But in marriage there is likewise communication between the persons and the union." St. Teresa says practically the same thing. There is the same difference between the spiritual betrothal and the spiritual marriage as there is between two betrothed persons, and two who are united so that they cannot be separated any more. In this grade of prayers there is a total lack of transformation of the soul into the beloved. The soul has entered into its very center, so to speak, which is the throne room of the interior castle, where the Trinity dwells through grace. There God and the soul give themselves up to each other in the consummation of divine love as far as possible in the present life. There is no more ecstasy, for the soul has now been strengthened to receive the full power of love, but in the brightness of an intellectual vision, the soul experiences the Trinity with vivid awareness. It sees these three persons individually, and yet, by a wonderful kind of knowledge which is given to us, The soul realizes that most certainly and truly all these persons are one substance, and one power, and one knowledge, and one God alone, so that what we hold by faith in the soul, for no imaginative version. Here all persons communicate themselves to the soul and speak with the soul and explain to it in those words which the gospel attributes to the Lord, namely, that he and the Father and the Holy Spirit will come to dwell with the soul, which loves him and keeps his commandments. We can distinguish the three elements of this loftiest prayer as a prayer of union, transformation in God, mutual surrender, and the permanent union of love. As St. John of the Cross states, the soul becomes brilliant and transformed in God, and God communicates to the soul his supernatural being to such an extent that the soul appears to be God and to have all that God has. Such a union is effected when God grants to the soul this supernatural mercy. As a result of all the things of God and the soul are one in a participated transformation. The soul seems to be more God than soul, and truly God by participation, although it is true that its being, so distinct by nature, is processed by the soul as something distinct from the being of God. It was formerly, even though transformed, just as the window is distinct from the ray of light which illuminates it. As to the mutual surrender, it is a natural consequence of the transforming union just described. Between God and the soul there are a perfect communication of the mutual gift of self, for which reason the prayer is transforming union is called the spiritual marriage. Lastly, St. Teresa teaches us that this grade of prayer, unlike the grades that preceded it, there is a permanency of union and love. Concomitant with the permanent union of love is the soul's confirmation in grace. St. John of the Cross maintains that the transforming union never falters and the soul is confirmed in grace. But St. Teresa warns that as long as we are in this world, we must walk with caution, lest we offend God. However, the apparent contradiction is readily resolved when we say that confirmation in grace does not mean intrinsic impeccability, for the Church teaches that it is an impossibility in this life. Nor is it a question of avoiding all venial sins in life, for that would require a special privilege of grace, as was bestowed on the Virgin Mary. Consequently, confirmation in grace must be understood as the special grace and assistance from God to avoid all mortal sins, and thus have moral certitude of salvation. Effects of transforming union. Perhaps no one has described as clearly as St. Teresa the marvelous effect produced in the soul by transforming union or mystical marriage. We shall summarize her description of these effects as given in her Interior Castle, Seventh Mansions, Chapter 3. 1. A forgetfulness of self, so complete that it seems as if the soul no longer existed. There is no longer any knowledge or remembrance of heaven or life, or honor as regards the soul. So completely is it absorbed in seeking the honor of God. The soul lives in a state of forgetfulness, so that it has no desire whatever in regard to self, but desires only to do what it can do to promote the glory of God, and for this it would gladly lay down its life. 2. A great desire to suffer. But now the desire does not disturb the soul as it did previously. So great is the soul's longing that the will of God be done in it, that it accepts whatever God wills as the best for it. If he sends suffering, well and good. If not, the soul does not worry or fret about it as it did previously. 3. Joy in persecution. When the soul is persecuted, it experiences a great interior joy and much more peace than formerly. It bears no enmity towards those who treat it badly and desire to do so. Rather, it conceives a special love for such persons. If it were to see them in some affliction, it would be deeply grieved, and would do all in its power to relieve them. It seems to commend such persons to prayer, and would likewise, at relinquishing some of the favors it receives from God, if it could bestow them on his enemies, and thus perhaps prevent them from offending God. 4. Desire to serve God. Whereas the soul formerly suffered because of its longing to die and to be with God, it now experiences a strong desire to serve God, and to help any soul that it can. Indeed, it now desires not to die, but to live for many years, and to suffer the most severe trials, if in this way it can be a means thereby God is praised. Its conception of glory is now connected in some way with helping Christ, especially when he sees how often people offend him, and how few there are who are truly concerned about his honor. 5. Detachment from everything created. The desire of the soul are no longer for consolations, because the soul realizes that now the Lord himself dwells within it. As a result, the soul experiences a marked detachment from everything, and a desire to be alone or to be occupied with something that will be beneficial to the soul. There is no more aridity or interior trial, but only a constant recollection in God and a tender love for him. There is no fear that this period of tranquility may be caused by the devil, because the soul has an unwavering certitude that it comes from God. This experience takes place in the very center of the soul, and in the highest faculty, into which the devil cannot enter. 6. Absence of ecstatics. Upon reaching this stance, the soul has no more raptures, or very seldom. A great weakness that formerly was the occasion for raptures has now been given a place to a great strength granted by God. Nevertheless, the soul walks with great care, and still does all its power to strengthen itself with the help of God's grace. Indeed, the more it is favored by God, the more cautious it becomes, and the more aware of its own littleness and humility. Ideal of Christian perfection. Such is the bittersweet path that leads to the heights of contemplative prayer and the transforming union. It is the sublime ideal of Christian perfection, and it is offered to all souls in grace. When Jesus pronounced the precept, "You must be made perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect," Matthew 5:48, he was speaking to all souls without exception. The Christian life, if it is to be developed according to the supernatural powers that are inherent in it, will lead to the transforming union of charity, which in turn the prelude to the beatific vision. The highest perfection consists not in interior favors, or in great raptures, or in visions or the prophecy of the Spirit, but in the bringing of our wills so closely into conformity with the will of God that, as soon as we realize he wills anything, we desire it ourselves with all our might, and take the bitter with the sweet, knowing that to be his Majesty's will.